This section of notes, we're going to be looking at industrialization and economic development. This is Unit 6. Since humans first began to farm 10,000 years ago during the Neolithic Revolution, the Earth's landscape has constantly changed as economic activities have evolved. The growth of cities is one consequence of industrialization, an economic change so recent in Earth's history that we cannot possibly understand how far-reaching its influence will be in the future. First subsection we want to look at is key concepts in industrialization and development. Basically, I'm just going to list off some key concepts. Imagine that. The first is industrialization. The definition of industrialization is the process by which economic activities on the Earth's surface evolved from producing basic primary goods, such as food products, to using factories for mass-producing goods for consumption. Another key term I want to look at is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution began this process of industrialization in England during the late 18th century. Now, we're going to get to the Industrial Revolution a little bit in the notes, but I want you to understand that the Industrial Revolution, although it began in England, it happened all over the world at all different times. In other words, it didn't all just happen simultaneously. Next thing I want to look at is the economic development. Economic development is the process of improving the material conditions of people through diffusion of knowledge and technology that has occurred as a result of industrialization. Economic development may be traced by examining three different types of economic activities. The first is a primary sector. That's one of the types of economic activities. Primary economic activity, this is getting the resource from the ground. The primary sector also, this is where agriculture is. This is the largest percentage of economic activity in less developed countries. And the primary sector developed 10,000 years ago, hence agriculture, Neolithic Revolution. Number two, the secondary sector. This is where industry actually is. This transforms raw materials into manufactured goods. This was created in the late 18th century by the Industrial Revolution, which replaced human and animal muscle with energy generated by machines. Then we have the tertiary sector, or the service industry sector. This grows with industrialization and comes to dominate what's known as post-industrial societies, or countries where most people are no longer employed in industry. So it's kind of a process. You could see countries go from a primary sector to a secondary sector, which is what the Industrial Revolution gave us. Then you move on to a tertiary sector, and nowadays the more developed nations are in a tertiary sector, which is also known as a post-industrial society. With post-industrial societies, a society's occupational structure changes significantly. You have construction, trade, finance, real estate, private services, government and transportation. More developed countries and less developed countries and newly industrializing countries all fit somewhere on these economic activities. One other thing that I want to add in the key concepts, even though it is not in your guide, is a cottage industry. This is not cottage cheese, although that sounds very delicious right now. A cottage industry is where manufacturing takes place in the home. Some places, like South Korea, have experienced what's known as compressed modernity. Compressed modernity is where rapid economic and political change happens, and this transforms the country into a stable nation with democratizing political institutions, a growing economy, and an expanding web of non-governmental institutions. Now, one thing I want to stop and point out to you is some more ideas. Again, this is not in your guide, but definitely important. We're going to look at first world, second world, third world, fourth world, and fifth world countries, what that means. A first world country is a country that is developed, it is capitalistic, and it is industrial. North America is an example of this. Western European countries are examples of this. Japan and then Australia all fit in the first world countries. Second world countries. These are the former communist, socialist, industrial states. Russia is an example of this. Eastern Europe are examples. The Turkic states of Kazakhstan are examples of this. China is an example of a second world. And also Cuba is an example of a second world. Then third world countries. All the other countries fit here. These are the developing countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Fourth world countries. These are places or nations of indigenous peoples. And then fifth world countries. These are those countries that have a lack of formal government. Now, the next thing I want to look at is economic indicators of development. First aspect is GDP, or gross domestic product. This is the value of the total output of goods and services produced in a country during the year. Dividing the GDP by the total population creates the gross domestic product per capita. This is a measure of the average person's contribution to generating a country's wealth in a year. Average GDP per capita that exceed $20,000 are what's known as more developed countries, MDCs. Average GDP per capita that are around $1,000 per year are LDCs, least developed countries. GDP per capita is strongly correlated to literacy rates and education levels because that's going to show you how much money you make. This map here shows you kind of the data there. $30,000 and above are the blue countries. United States, Canada, some Western European countries. 20 to 30, Western Europe, Australia. 10 to 20, Russia, South Africa, Argentina, some of those areas, and then so forth and so forth. Next thing that determines economic indicators of development is types of jobs. More developed countries, you have less people in the primary industries, more in your tertiary and quaternary. Less developed countries, you have more people in the primary. Newly industrialized countries are kind of in between. You have some in primary, some in tertiary, some in secondary, kind of all over the place. Number 3, worker productivity. Workers in more developed countries are more productive than in less developed countries. That's because of a lot of reasons. Productivity can be measured by what's known as value added by each worker. The value added in manufacturing may be figured by subtracting the costs of raw materials and energy from the gross value of the product. The value added in more developed countries is much higher than in less developed countries. There's also 2 terms that I want to add here to your guide. First is upward transition. If a nation is known as an upward transition nation, that means it's looking up, it's looking good. If it's a downward transition, that means things are looking bad, it's looking down. Next thing I want to look at is the access to raw materials. Development requires access to raw materials, energy to operate factories, coal, oil, water, natural gas. One reason the Industrial Revolution began in England is because it's access to coal. Today, countries gain access to these natural resources and to these raw materials through world trade, but you have to have access to raw materials to be developed. Number 5, availability of consumer goods. Most developed countries, MDCs, more developed countries, not only have enough wealth for essential goods and services, but you also have money for non-essentials or consumer goods. And these consumer goods are available for people in more developed countries. Economic development is often associated by what's known as social development, such as high rates of literacy, access to formal education, and good health care. Economic development also changes demographic characteristics such as life expectancy, birth rates, and death rates.